Oh, okay. So thank you all for coming. It's very good to see you on a wonderful Saturday afternoon. Thank you, Christie, for coming and agreeing to do the lecture for us. We're really excited about your presentation. Christie has been a member of the American Conifer Society for well over 20 years. She got the conifer bug from her father and mother up in Rochester, New York. She also owns a nursery landscaping business in Boston, where she does installation and maintenance and garden design. She's created over several hundred gardens in the Boston area. Sorry, I lost my place. Christie's study of landscape design and horticulture includes training from the Landscape Institute, formerly Radcliffe seminars, UMass Extension, Green School, and countless educational and certificate awarding seminars. Coupled with her gardening passion, she has grown C.D. and Company into an award-winning firm that values innovative design, practical solutions, superior plants, and excellent plant care. Christie has a gift for keen listening and tailors every project to the needs and tastes of her clients. And if you go to her website, you can see some fabulous pictures of her designs. It's quite impressive. So Christie, thank you. You can start whenever you're ready.
Awesome. All right. So you can hear me okay? Jeff?
Yes, we're good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. I know it's either earlier or mid-afternoon, depending on where you're coming in from. So I appreciate you taking the time to tune in. We're going to look at some awesome photos. So hopefully, at least by the end, you'll feel inspired for the rest of your day. So we're going to talk about Japanese inspired gardens. And to get started, I want to just start off with a definition. So today for my talk, there's a difference between a Japanese garden and a Japanese inspired garden. So a Japanese garden is a garden in Japan, whereas a Japanese inspired garden is a garden inspired by the art form of gardens in Japan and is outside of Japan. So if you think about probably the preeminent, as close as you can get to a bona fide Japanese garden in this country, the Portland Japanese garden, even that is, it's noted that it's one of the most beautiful and authentic Japanese gardens in the world outside of Japan. So there is something inherent and spiritually and culturally specific about a Japanese garden in Japan. And so I want to be clear that what I'm talking about today is really how to become inspired by a Japanese garden and potentially have some of that feeling in your own garden. So just kind of my caveat is that I'm not an expert on Japanese gardens. This lecture is my opinion. I am a garden designer passionate about Japanese gardens, and I do integrate what I see as the design elements and building blocks and styles of Japanese gardens in my own work, both at my house and professionally. And I'm relating to you what I have internalized and studied. I'm going to show photos of gardens that I have visited in Japan, as well as gardens that I've designed here in the Northeast. So first of all, you know, what makes a garden Japanese? So when I Googled Japanese gardens, this is a photo that I found. So, and to me, it really exemplifies what is not a Japanese garden. So simply amassing lots of traditional design elements and objects and putting them in the confines of a garden area does not make a garden Japanese. I think, you know, when I look at this particular photo, I would give an A for effort. But I think what I'm seeing here is that the essence of a Japanese garden is missing. And what is that essence that's not here? Because it doesn't seem to come from the objects themselves, just having a Buddha or a some stones or a Japanese maple, that doesn't seem to do it. And furthermore, when I did that Googling, I found that you could go to Lowe's and you could buy this kit of Japanese garden plants. And I think what this speaks to me is that there is this mystique and this intrigue of Japanese gardens. People want to somehow create that and bring it into their garden, but we're at a loss as to where to start. So I think designing a garden that is inspired by a Japanese garden is more than just buying 12 plants, including a Japanese maple, and planting them in this sort of configuration. So what can we start to put our finger on what are those design elements and design sensibilities? So in Japanese itself, they do refer to these two sides, that a garden that is Japanese in appearance only, because it has miscellaneous Japanese elements, is said to be just Japanese wind. So something that just kind of blows through. It really has no staying power, no inner essence, versus a garden that is thoroughly Japanese in principle, spirit, and technique, is said to have Japanese heart or spirit. And I think that's what we're going for, any of us who are interested in trying to do something in your own garden. So this is something that I find very, very, very fascinating, and speaks again to this idea that I, as a American-born, raised person, I will never be able to say that I am a true dyed-in-the-wool Japanese garden maker. And if you look at how the skill set, the art form of Japanese garden making is taught in Japan, it is primarily experiential. So if you look at these two different ways of learning that I have on the screen here, the art of Japanese gardens in Japan is primarily taught by doing. So it's by viewing the work of past masters, learning from nature, apprenticeship, oral transmission, and there are secret texts which have been translated that date back, over 1,000 years. So this is an art form that has, just hundreds and hundreds of years of refinement. Whereas generally in the West, the way that we learn is by sitting in a classroom and being talked at. It's verbal education that we receive primarily in the West, as opposed to experiential. So there's really a key difference between the two different ways of learning. And this is a photo from the Portland Japanese garden. And a truly Japanese garden requires an intensive amount of maintenance that is really beyond what most of us would be able to do without quitting our jobs and hiring a cohort to come in every day. Here is one of their gardens, and you see the number of volunteers that it takes to keep the gravel, absolutely pristine. So a traditional Japanese garden really is beyond the capability of most of us. So how could we bring some of that design sensibility to our own garden? This is a garden I designed in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So my goal today is what can we extrapolate from traditional Japanese gardens to infuse into our gardens? So we're going to look at design principles and we're going to look at garden materials. So this is just a list of the key design principles that I'm going to be talking about today. It's not, I'm not going to go through each one of them right here, but there are certain, and these are things that I've culled both from my own experience and from reading, but there are certain ways of thinking about design and that I think can bring that spirit that we're looking for. So first we're going to talk about line, and line is a visual and design construct. And line is, you might not hear anyone, talking about this idea of line. It seems so elemental, but lines really do create our visual environment. They're the primary building block of design. So lines define spaces by enclosing them, by creating shapes. They define the landscape because your eye traces the forms and the shapes. So, without lines, the world would seem fuzzy and out of focus. And one thing that I want you to pay attention to as we go through the lecture today is I want you to notice what happens with your eyes. So for me, when I look at these two different squares that I have here on the screen, when I look at the top one, my eye traces the lines and I'm kind of done with it. It's static. I don't continue to go back to it and retrace it. Whereas when I look at the square on the bottom, my eye traces that curve and it goes up and back and up and back. And it's much more dynamic. It's much more visually intriguing and appealing, and it engages my eye. And what I want to suggest is that one of the things about Japanese gardens is that there's a strong use of line that's very engaging of the eye. So clarity of line defines our visual world. So if you are like me, if I was to try to talk to you without my readers on, I'm going to have trouble seeing. The world is fuzzy. So for me, that clarity of line is so important to being able to see things. So lines define shapes. And lines define where space and where mass or objects are going in the landscape. So when I'm planning a landscape, how do I communicate my ideas? I'm communicating them by setting down lines on a piece of paper that are showing where things go. So there's a direct relationship between what's on a piece of paper, what's in real life, how I lay things out, where things go. And I want to show kind of this difference here. This is a house that I drive by, and I've been tempted many times to stop and drop off a note to say, I see that you're planting things, but I can't make any sense out of what you're doing. Now, obviously, I'm not going to drop that note off. It's a bit presumptuous, but what I'm trying to say is that there's a lack of organization and there's a lack of clear line to show maybe what's the grass, what's the planting bed, what's supposed to be happening in the photo on the right. Whereas if you look at this picture on the left, which is just a snippet of a Japanese garden, you'll see that there's very crisply defined planting beds. It's not ambiguous. You can clearly trace, the outside of it, the path. Your eye can trace the lines that are raked into the gravel. My eye can trace around where the moss is. It can interact with the boulders. So there's something about that even though my eye is active, it's peaceful because it's not confusing. So without clear lines, landscape space can really look incoherent and chaotic. So as a member of the Conifer Society, I've been able to visit many private gardens, and this is a garden on Long Island. And the reason that I show it is not because it has anything to do with the Japanese garden, but it shows very clearly the use of line. So, you know, here you have this amazing undulating form of the grass against these granite tiers. So you have waves of where you are going to have a void, and you're going to have mass, and you're going to have void, and you're going to have mass. And it's really starkly revealed by line. It's line that helps me see this, and it engages my eye, engages my imagination, and is a tool to use in your garden. I think about who has to take care of that, and I'm glad it's not me. So lines define the edges of space, indicating what's inside and what's outside. Lines help to organize space. So my experience of seeing just anything in Japan, so this is a picture that I took walking down a sidewalk in Japan on the right-hand side, like the care and the effort to define that space using the pieces of stone, using the intricate bamboo fencing, the lines on the sidewalk. So it's just a very organized sense of how to lay out space and show it. On the left-hand side, seeing the hedge and the other use of line there. So vertical lines, they divide space and they provide rhythm. So one of the most famous temples, the Saihoji Temple, the Moss Temple in Kyoto. And if you look at the picture on the left, you'll see that use of line, which is the tree trunks. So it's a way of dividing up space, the way of introducing verticality into a garden. And we happen to be there in November, where you see what are most likely all green, shades of green Japanese maples turning color. So that ephemeral moment when the garden really changes and becomes something quite spectacular in a colorful way. Or in this other temple garden, the timber bamboo. And, here's a way of doing that using very different materials. So this is Dale Chihuly glass sculptures. And you see, like, if you were just to come upon one in the garden, like on the left-hand side, if you were just, walking in an area planted with ornamental grasses, and you saw one blue, upright spike, that's interesting, but it's not as interesting if you look at the picture on the right, where you see multiple of them, and it really starts to provide a sense of rhythm. And if you're like me, my eye kind of bounces between all the guys and then comes back. And this is a very engaging composition that is created with maybe 2 or 3 kinds of grasses and some sort of looks like either hemlock or yew clipped hedge backdrop. Obviously, the color is also an intriguing element. So in a Japanese garden, in addition to just the use of line, there's this idea that you have something rigid and something organic, and you put them together, you juxtapose them. So this yin and yang idea, how seemingly opposite or contrary forces may actually be complementary, interconnected, and interdependent. So if you look at this vignette here, You have the foxtails, which are very rigid, very upright and straight. And you have that juxtaposed with what seems to be a boulder that has not been worked, except that the top of it has been cut off and a perfect circle for a basin has been added. So to me, there's something so exciting about, putting together something that is rigid and something that is organic. And to me, there's a synergy there that is more than the sum of the two parts. And this is a technique that you'll see a lot in Japanese gardens. This is my own design work. So curved lines add movement. This is a garden that needed to also read from the second story, looking down on it. So you see that the walls, that the patio, that the planting beds there's a very clean and clear line that at least my eye travels along to interact with this garden in a visual kind of a way. And our eyes trace lines and we decide, whether it feels balanced or not. So here, I'm suggesting that maybe if you were sitting on the patio, your eye might go off, in this direction, your eye might come in this direction. And, does it feel balanced? And our eyes trace what it perceives as lines. And oftentimes in a Japanese garden, there will be paths, and the path really reads as a line, even though it's a set of, individual stepping stones. And in a Japanese garden, sometimes the paths are to be walked on, and sometimes they are simply to be viewed. And I think that in a Japanese garden, they're much more skilled at bringing in our imagination. Not everything has to be spelled out. Not everything has to be touched and stepped on. So this idea that, on one side of the bank of this little water area here, my eye can go out and can go up the steps on the other side, and it can come back. So it's really engaging much more than just, my feet on the ground. It's engaging what's happening in my mind. And that's something that I try to bring into my design work here. So lines guide us. And again, to speak to that, the idea of a psychic line. So if you look at this very famous small little garden, Japanese garden, my eye will visually trace these boulders to add movement and purpose. So my eye might kind of start out on this single guy, then jump over to this guy, then kind of go up to this guy and boop, 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 all the way up to the top, and then back down and jump back over here. So, whoops. The idea that, again, how does our garden inspire the imagination, kind of bring us into a sense of motion in the garden. So lines make shapes. Here, all of these pieces of granite are, have an exterior line that makes them into a shape. And you'll notice the use of threes. So you've got the three lanterns, and the use of triangles. So you have kind of one area of the gravel, one area of the granite laying down, the pieces of granite that are standing up. And this is just a very small little tiny pocket garden on a streetscape. And does it feel balanced when you look at it? So the takeaway for lines and how they work in Japanese gardens is that there's a use of very clear, non-muddied lines to lay out the space and organize it. And the eye follows those lines, sees those shapes, And that is a primary way of experiencing the landscape. Runs direct foot traffic, and your eye is always scanning to see if the garden, if the way that it's laid out, what you're seeing with your eyes, if it feels balanced. So we're going to talk about balance, which is critical in a Japanese garden. So that pleasing sense of calmness in a Japanese garden really depends on a strong sense of balance. There's a little garden I did in Cambridge also. So the idea of running the paving material on an angle instead of having the wall be, at right angles to the fence that was already there, having that at an angle. So how do things feel balanced? So what is balance? I would say that primarily we understand balance because we feel it in our bodies. So as a kid, kids are all about trying to figure out balance, right? So a seesaw is a perfect way to start to experience that in your body. And when I was at this UNESCO site in India, looking at this boulder, from the perspective that I'm looking at it, I'm thinking perhaps I don't need the ticket home, right? Like here's this enormous boulder that's like obviously going to come down the hill and run me over. So I'm scanning to see, does what I'm looking at feel balanced or not? Do I sense danger? Do I sense something is not right? But when I see it from the side and I recognize that in fact it's not a perfectly round boulder and it is balanced on that edge, I feel a lot better. So how can we bring in a little bit of that tension that might feel energizing, but not a sense of, uh-oh, something's really off here. So with balance, it's that even distribution of weight. And this is how we typically think about it, right? So what's on one side is on the other side. We create this central axis down the middle of it for the vertical axes, and a lot of garden design is based on that kind of balance. But for Japanese gardens, they really rely on counterbalance. So the idea that two weights do balance each other, but they are not the same, and they are not equal spaced on either side of the fulcrum or the central axis. So one force does balance the other force. So looking at this, like these stones, like, and the little tongue depressor or whatever it is, like that is so much more interesting to me than looking at a traditional scale with, two of the same things on either side. So here's two examples where the objects are balanced on both sides of that fulcrum. But if you are like me, I'm much more inclined to look at the top one because it's just visually interesting. I think to myself, oh, those two little green guys, they're balancing that bigger red guy. And then when I look at the bottom, I'm like, okay, those two round circles and squares, they balance each other, who cares? So there's a sense of activity and action that happens with asymmetrical balance. I just took this picture from a magazine, and this really exemplifies or typifies symmetrical balance, the idea that what is on one side is on the other side. And I'm not saying that it's not beautiful. This is actually quite a lovely example of symmetrical balance. But in a Japanese garden, asymmetrical balance is favored, and this is an essential design difference. So this is a design that I did some years ago, and I specified all these pieces of granite to make this kind of central courtyard. And I could have just, had it run straight up to the door and, have things come off at right angles. But instead, I have things, working asymmetrically in a way that is much more engaging when you're on the site, as well as from all of these other vantage points looking down at it. And just to kind of drive home the difference between a symmetrical plan and a symmetrical plan, I just Googled symmetrical garden plan and came up with what you see here on the right-hand side. So, if you've traveled in Europe, some of the traditional gardens, very symmetrical layout, and I'm not saying that they're not beautiful. There is a certain beauty to that, but it is a different kind of a style than what you're going to see in a traditional Japanese garden. So in our landscapes and gardens, we do seek visual balance. We want it to feel okay. And like I said, it could be through symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, or there's also radial balance, where you're creating balance by putting something in a circle around a central object. So my father and I, we went to Japan about 20 years ago, and we visited the Miho Museum. And the way that you get there is you literally walk through a mountain. It is a museum that is built into a mountain. So you walk through this tunnel, and as you're walking through, you start to see the front door of the museum, the circular pane of glass. And as you come upon it, you arrive and you see that, in fact, the door, the circle is broken in a symmetrical way with that axis right down through the middle. But when you look through, you see that it is framing two pines in an asymmetrical way. Right, that the two pines are not lined up on that central axis through the door. And the fact that the one pine kind of reaches out over to the left, it's balanced by that weight of it is balanced by its friend over here on the right-hand side. And, it's just stunning, this use of asymmetry. And again, two different gardens, similar materials, very different feeling, both using a very strong use of line. So this is a garden that I saw in Ireland, and, there's absolutely nothing left to chance here, right? Like everything is bone straight, the trees no longer have any of their own characteristics. They're basically curated. It's a curated set of shapes that happens to also perform photosynthesis. The picture on the right-hand side, you have those strong lines, but everything is balanced in an asymmetrical kind of a way. You have the mass of the background planting here is kind of offset by the horizontal plane of the sand in the foreground. So asymmetrical balance in Japanese gardens, they avoid the center placement of a focal point. So we don't set up a traditional center axis. You can see if you look at the center of this photo, there's things happening on one side, things happening on the other side, and they balance each other out, but they are not the same. And they frame asymmetrical views. So I would offer that if this same set of stairs was built here in the United States, in a million years, no one would build it so far off center. Like someone would come up upon this and be like, did like, did the wall get put in the wrong place or the stairs get put in the wrong place? Like, why are these things not lined up? Whereas in a traditional Japanese garden and traditional Japanese garden making, that is very intentionally done. So I want to talk about, in a Japanese garden, the use, the intermixing and the intentional use of horizontal, vertical, and diagonal planes are very powerful tools in Japanese gardens. And each one, like, so here, horizontal, vertical, and diagonal, each one of these planes elicits a specific and fundamental aesthetic response. And these are garden teachings that are, date back to probably over 1,000 years ago, but they were first described in the 1400s. This is a garden here that is from the 1300s. I mean, we're talking about a depth of art form that is quite amazing. So if you take nothing else away from the talk, I want you to take away that in a Japanese garden, the use of a scaling triangle is key. Very rarely will you see things set up as an equilateral triangle, where all the sides are equal, all the angles are equal. Generally, you will see that the sides are different lengths and the angles are different. And they're created by these three forces. So a scaling triangle just feels more natural, more dynamic, and more inviting in the garden. It's so much less predictable. Like if I look at this equilateral triangle, I mean, to me, it's boring. The scaling triangle, I find personally interesting. And to me, it feels like it has some gravitas. It has some weight to it. So in terms of horizontal planes, I think carefully about what is happening on the horizontal plane in the designs that I'm doing. This is a garden design that I did, and this has absolutely nothing to do with a Japanese garden, but there was an intentional planning of, I intentionally thought about the horizontal space for this sense of expansiveness, serenity at the entry. The horizontal plane is associated with kind of the level of earth, and it evokes a groundedness, a serenity. Whereas vertical planes really evokes that tension and the opposition to the force of gravity. So here, one of my favorite kinds of plants, the Nucatensis, this is a Vandenacker, this conifer that just thrusts up into the air is, to me, so energetic and so, I don't know, just really energizing in a garden. In this particular little garden that we saw a picture from a different perspective, we salvaged and replanted this Chamaecyparis, this Hinoki cypress here, for that vertical accent that helps to link it to, how vertical the house is. So the diagonal plane is associated with objects under the force of gravity, and it evokes kind of a dynamism because it's not standing perfectly up and it's not laying perfectly down. It's on an angle. So for me, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about the ground plane. I'm thinking about diagonals. I'm thinking about verticals. And, it adds a lot of dynamic interest. This is a garden that I did where I literally punched kind of a naturalistic looking pond into a very staid traditional bluestone patio. So the stone groupings are often in triangles with horizontal, vertical, and diagonal planes. So here you have a diagonal plane. Here you have you have horizontal, you have vertical. So, what makes this arrangement of very, very simple elements interesting and dynamic is the fact that there's been thought about using
Question, if you bought it,
yeah, those three different energy angles. So this is a very famous museum. I have not seen this in person, but the reason that I put this photo here is I know when I started out planting trees, my father gave me a what do you call that? Gum bob, the thing the piece of metal that you hang, and it gives you a vertical, a perfect, true vertical line. And I was taught that you always plant trees, using that perfect vertical line. And what I want to show you here in this garden is that you will be hard pressed to find any one of these trees that is growing in a perfect vertical, with perfect verticality. All of these pines have been planted at some sort of an angle. And what does that do? That makes this, which could be like a forest kind of a planting, it makes it so much more dynamic and interesting. I think it's just fascinating. So it's not that I go out and, I no longer plant trees straight up and down. It really depends on the location, but there are times that I will take a specimen conifer generally, or perhaps a maple, and intentionally plant it at some sort of an angle for that additional energizing effect. So here, very famous garden, the Rowan-G Temple, where there's 7 groupings of stones. And when you're on the viewing platform, it is difficult to see all of them at the same time. And if you notice how, at least my eye kind of bounces between the stones, bonk, 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 there's some sort of a balance between, kind of this massive flat horizontal plane, the vertical plane behind it of all of the plants. And you would think that, wow, this is like so simplistic. But if you look at, here's what somebody did where they, I'm not going to try to pronounce his name, but he mapped out all of the location of those stones in this temple and drew lines between all of the interactions between the stones. And you see the amazing dynamism that underlies this garden that seems so like it could just be very simple, but there's very complex interactions between all of those elements. So in terms of design principles, we've talked about use of line, asymmetrical balance, triangles, and those 3 forces. So now we're going to move on to naturalistic setting. So traditionally, Japanese gardens, or at least the ones I've seen in Japan, they're nostalgic of nature. So they may try to draw in some imagery of mountains, water, forests. So maybe this is mountain, these are mountains, this is water. So the idea that they're drawing upon natural themes. This is one of the oldest examples of what is called a dry waterfall. So this arrangement of stones in this little little tiny valley area here, back to the late 1200s, early 1300s. A Japanese garden artist created this dry waterfall, evoking mountains, water, forest. So this is in my own garden. It could be, that you have a dry stream, a dry waterfall, or a dry pond. And our garden was featured in Fine Gardening a couple of years ago, and before they came to take the pictures, I became a crazy person, and this was me arranging all of the stones. So if any of you have been on tours or whatever, you know what happens to you. It's never looked like that since, but the idea of adding a bridge that has water or symbolic water. And I would suggest that in an American garden, we like this play of the use of lines on this bridge, to me, is so artistic and so unexpected. I love it. So then we get into the topic of boulders, and this is one of I have certain places I enjoy driving by, and I have various positive or negative thoughts, some of which I would not want broadcast. And like when I drive by this particular house and I see those 3 boulders that right now in this picture, they have the black mulch. In recent years, they've had the red pretend, bright red mulch, which is even sadder. Like I feel like these 3 boulders, they just want to huddle together. Like they're very sad to be stranded so far apart. Like they just want to cuddle. So I've done a fair amount of boulder setting, and there's so much that is written about this. It is an amazing art form, but it generally does start with some sort of a central stone and a secondary stone that you see that there's a little bit of a slope here that helps to connect these 2 stones to each other. And then the 3rd stone down here helps to anchor it. And generally the outside form is in a scaling triangle. It's a classic Japanese garden boulder arrangement. So the idea is how I think about it as, one boulder being friends with its neighbor. So from the secret teaching on setting stones, this is back from the 1028 AD. The quote is, "Choose a particularly splendid stone and set it as the main stone. Then, following the request of the first stone, set others accordingly." So, you may have also done this too, going to stone yards, going to quarries, picking stones, trying to find stones that look like they will harmonize with each other. And the idea that the stone has a spirit and can talk and can interact with his friend. So this was soon after I bought our current house, and this really made the neighbors very nervous because a whole bunch of boulders showed up in the front yard. And we started to set them in the back, and now we use web straps, not these chains, but at the time, this is what we were doing to set the boulders to create this raised boulder garden. And here you see in the back the finish of kind of these 2 main stone elements in our backyard years ago. This entrance pad, the double patio, and the boulder bed. So the idea of the 3 boulders, a boulder kind of laying down So then we put up the Japanese style gate. And over time, all of that grass just about has disappeared. And that gate is constructed such that when you look through it, you do not see the boulder garden straight on, you see it off center. So the use of those boulders and then bringing in conifers, bringing in other objects. And then I brought in another big boulder that has this hole in it and setting it. And that boulder today in the garden. And I have to say that I'm just completely and absolutely addicted to stone. And I think a garden without stone can be a sad thing. This is 5 years after that initial stonework was done in the back. You see my own Vanden Acker here in the garden. 10 years later, and then a couple of years later, looking from a different vantage point, again, through that gate where the boulder bed is not symmetrical. So the use of boulders as a way of marking an entry point, kind of like a gate, and they're a focal point. So here I do have 3. Boulders under a deck. So if you have been to traditional Japanese gardens, I think one of the most fascinating design elements is the walkways and the design that goes into pieced walkways. I just could bend down and kiss them. I think they're so fabulous. And this idea of really creating very interesting lines and patterns using stone on that horizontal plane. Many different kinds of paths that have been formalized in diagrams. But generally, here's more of a symmetrical layout, but generally they're more asymmetrical in their layout. Here's a couple of paths in my own garden. Here's an entranceway for a garden that I designed. I wouldn't call this Japanese, but the attention to detail and the interest that gets created on that horizontal ground plane, I think does hearken to some Japanese principles.
Here's a gallery, Joyce.
Someone is
Jeffrey Ditch.
Joshua, I think you're unmuted. Thank you. Okay, sorry. So the use of line, and not only the use of line, but the use of S-curves is commonly found in Japanese gardens. In my own garden, I used a wall that was in a slight S-curve. The fence behind that Patty built has curves that kind of evoke almost ripples in water. They're unpredictable. They're engaging. They somehow seem more natural than a traditional kind of a fence or a wall. So when we think about Japanese gardens and hearkening to nature, the use of water, the use of boulders, stone, and then the use of plants. And generally, the plants that you would see in a traditional Japanese garden have been stylized in some way to look like they have been windswept, or that they're older, that they're mature, that they have that sense of gravitas. And again, that idea of bringing in the diagonal, the the vertical and the horizontal plane. So the bonsai really has taken this art form to a whole nother level in terms of stylizing plants. But, you know, we can do some of that in our own gardens. So, you know, I had the opportunity to watch this Japanese garden master prune this pine and really trying to simulate the effects of age and wind and reveal that inner structure of the plant, those lines, rather than it being a blob. The idea that less is more is a truism when it comes to planting in a traditional Japanese garden. There's much more of a focus on shrubs, evergreens, ground covers, rather than perennials. So more of a limited palette. And interestingly, there's really almost no use or very minimal use of cultivars. So this is back at Saihoji, the temple moss garden. The Japanese maples that are in this garden, there's no red Japanese maples. There's no Japanese maples that have, you know, variegated foliage, that have different kinds of foliage. They're generally the straight species. And the goal is to really have a chorus rather than having a rock star, is my understanding. And that is not how I plant my own garden as a plant collector, but there's much more of a refined palette and limited palette in a traditional Japanese garden, with the idea that, you know, those times of the year where there really is that ephemeral moment where those plants get to show off. So must a Japanese garden have bamboo or moss or a Japanese maple or a sculptural pine? And I would say, you know, yes, it could, but there's other plants that could be used for that similar impact and function. So there are clumping bamboos that may be hardy where you live as opposed to running bamboos. There's many kinds of Japanese maples if you do want to, you know, hearken to a Japanese garden, but yet you're a plant collector. And I'm talking mostly to the converted here, but finding and using interesting conifers in the garden is really one of the prime ways that I try to bring in the use of that verticality, the diagonal and the horizontal planes. So joining the American Conifer Society. But it could be something else that performs a similar function. So for me, I get moss where I don't want it, and I don't get moss where I want it. So, you know, what else could I use for that kind of green ground plane plant? So maybe it's Wallsteinia, or maybe it's a kind of a sedum, or, you know, this little dwarf lady's mantle. So, you know, what else could I use that could create that same impact, but with a plant that works better in my own region? And like even here, this use of the hostas, you know, do I see hostas in a traditional Japanese garden? Not really. I don't know that I ever have, but this idea of them being almost like water moving through those tree trunks. And I just took this picture here on the right off the internet because, like, looking at the stepping stones that are in the lawn that reminded me of this particular temple where the stepping stones are in the moss. And, you know, here having like some simple lines, and, you know, is this picture here on the right a Japanese garden? No, it's not, but there's a certain simplicity to it and intentionality to it that I think does evoke some of those Japanese garden principles. This is in my own garden. So, how to blend different textures and shapes and objects together. I probably am I'm not so much on the less is more, but I really aim for that sense of blending. So if we move past what's in the garden, there's a few more metrics that I want to talk about. And one of them is this idea of hide and reveal. The idea that that you don't see everything all at once. So it invites you into the garden, and the vantage point, what you're looking at, changes as you move through the garden. Here's an example of it from Jerry and Karen Krall's garden in Rochester that I'm sure many of you have been to. This idea that, there's something around the corner. So it engages the imagination rather than, I think, a lot of traditional gardens where the plants are all around the edges and there's lawn in the center, and your kitchen window that you look out all the time, you look out and you see everything all at the same time. So what I'm trying to do from those primary vantage points is how can I do something that is more visually and mentally imaginative and engaging. Here's a drawing that I did for a Japanese inspired garden. You see that on the ground plane is this, basically it's a stone wall that tapers down and hits the ground plane and finishes off just on the ground plane. So, as you're walking in here, you can't see everything at the same time. And here is that garden. So the wall that's coming down onto the ground plane, and what's around the corner, that hide and reveal. And in Japanese gardens, there's very intentional framing of the view. And I would suggest that the windows in our homes do that very same thing. They frame what we see when we look outside. And I try to design thinking about what is it that, this window is allowing the viewer a very, a curated view out into the landscape. How am I going to handle that? So when they frame a view, as I said, that focal point is generally off center. So when you're sitting on this platform and you open the doors to look out into the garden, you have a particular view. And I did that sort of thing with this design at a library near where I live, where they had these big windows inside the library that look out. So I intentionally designed boulder vignettes and planting vignettes to be seen both from outside and inside. So from inside here, they're looking at one of the boulder vignettes. So that idea of inside, outside, framing a view. And we can do it, very simply, just like as you walk through a gate is a way of framing a view. The gate is closed, the gate opens. What do you see? And this idea of having a gate, this idea of entry. So this is a garden that I designed with the homeowner who, was really interested in doing some very out of the box things, including the fence that you see in the back. And here's not everyone has a upside down boat for their arbor, but this idea of entry and passage and enclosure is very strong in Japanese gardens. You will not see a Japanese garden that looks like this. So my experience of walking around here at the Imperial Palace, I felt like I never felt cozy, and I never felt like there was a place that I wanted to go. Whereas when I'm in a Japanese garden, this is not a Japanese garden, but it has that element of intimacy, of enclosure, and I try to bring that into gardens that I design. And sometimes this is less of an opportunity for us in the city, but this idea of enlarging the visual scale of the garden beyond its boundaries. So for this garden that I designed here, this woodland that you see is actually not the homeowner's property, but they're borrowing it. So the idea of borrowing the view. So in this Japanese garden here, they're borrowing the view of Mount Fuji. You know, and how does the mass of that interact with the mass of the very carefully raked gravel? So we've talked about line, balance, the use of kind of evoking some sort of a naturalistic setting, less is more, framing, viewpoints, that focal points are usually off center. The idea of enclosure, the idea of hiding and revealing. So these design principles that we can use in our gardens to try to bring in that sense of spirit, that sense of place. And we can bring it to our homes. This is from Phyllis Comens's garden in Weston that will be on a rendezvous here in the Boston area, June 10th and 11th this year. This is a garden design that we worked on some years ago. You know, so how can you bring it home? And I'll end with this photo, which I think is so simple, yet so sophisticatedly evocative. So, you know, here there's a wooden platform where you see the grain of that wood. And you see the stone that has, you know, some slight folding in, some veining, some texture in it. And you see the sand that has been so carefully raked around it, and that kind of attention to detail, that use of line, that very careful composition, I think is what really makes a place special, and I think is something that we can bring to our gardens here at home. So that is it. And I hope that that was interesting, and I will stop sharing and see if anyone has any questions.
That was great, Christie. Thank you.
Thank you.
We had a couple people had to leave early, but they all said it was a fascinating presentation and they really enjoyed it. Very inspiring. A couple people said we have to do the best we can to encourage you to do more of these every year for us.
Who is that person?
I have to find it back in chat again. Oh, Scotty Hart from California.
Okay.
So yeah, he's enjoyed a lot of our presentations this year. So
Good.
Good to see him back again. Let me see what else is going on here. Lots of people saying how nice it was. They appreciate appreciate it.
Great.
Wonderful pictures. Someone's asking, do you prune to achieve a specific design?
So that's obviously a question that has a lot to it. I think for me, when I am pruning, I prune to try to reveal the inner essence of the plant. So that's different than taking a plant and trying to force it to, you know, to weep or to be upright or to do something that I want, you know, to become a shape that I want in the garden. For me, when I'm designing a garden, I think about the shape that I want, and then I pick a plant that wants to do that. And then my goal with garden care and pruning is to continue to refine and guide and partner with that plant to be all that it can be. So I hope that is a way of answering that question, but yes.
Sorry, Scotty, I don't know where he came from. Someone also asked, when you are about to start a garden, do you incorporate one principle at a time, or do you plan carefully to include as many as possible?
That's a great question. I will say that for me at this point, I don't think specifically about each one of those in the way that I broke them down in the lecture today, but I bring all of those ideas to the gardens that I design, and very few people that I'm designing for will specifically ask me for a Japanese garden, but I will bring this sort of sensibility to the garden design that I do. And for me, a critical component that I always think about is that viewpoint. What are the views that you're looking out all the time? And then I'm designing from that point of view to create, you know, really a year-round engaging vignette that you are seeing. So that is something that is in all of my gardens, but not all of my gardens have boulders or sculptural conifers, although most of them do.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Let me see. Oh, someone was from north of Boston, so hopefully they'll be able to make it on your rendezvous this summer. That'd be
Yes.
awesome. I think I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording, and if anybody has any questions about anything else coming up, we can talk about those.